Capcom's arcade output has largely always been incredible, especially when you get to their prime of the 90s. Thanks to Street Fighter 2 and the like, not to mention all sorts of other legendary CP System 1 and 2 titles, Capcom were a dominant force in the arcades that you simply couldn't escape from. I thought I should do a little something for their formative arcade years, mind you, a little look at the games they released in the 1980s. Cause hey, the selection of games here isn't exactly lacking either. Right from their original formation in 1983 as Capsule Computers, it took barely any time for Capcom to release freaking outstanding titles. Now sure, there was a little bit of headhunting involved. There was the poaching of the likes of Yoshiki Kihaji Okamoto, Takuro Professor F Fujiwara, and Takashi Piston Nishiyama from Konami and IREM, the company that founder Kenzo Sugimoto was previously the president of, but the results from grabbing such talented coders and planners came pretty sharpish. As a result of that, we've got 35 80s arcade games to look at in this video. Certainly not as many as some other companies, largely because, as mentioned, Capcom didn't release any video games until 1984, but, well, the majority of these games are essential. It's not always the case on this channel that I get to eat well for the duration and not have the odd plate of smelly brown stuff shoved in my direction, but 1980s Capcom arcade games? Well, that's a rare feast indeed, one where even the lesser games are still usually absolutely worthwhile. Even Peter Pepper himself couldn't have done a better job. Anywho, we've got everything from those early years to the end of the decade, and the first few titles released on Capcom's CP System platform, and as ever we are going to do this mostly in A to Z form. Anything that is a series or very much related to each other will be covered all together, although that's not a major issue here. And so, well, let's get going. Naturally, we are kicking off strong with 1942. Yoshiki Okamoto designed this 1984 game, his second for Capcom. He was hired by Kenzo Sugimoto after previously scoring hits at Konami with the likes of Time Pilot and Giras. This was the fourth arcade game that Capcom put out there, and it became the company's first worldwide arcade smash. Indeed, it was largely designed with Western markets in mind, and it's one of the earliest classic top-down shoot-em-ups to really score big sales outside of Japan, definitely bigger than the earlier likes of Exevius. Naturally, the game is set in the midst of World War II, and your Lockheed P-38 Lightning's got to shoot down as many Japanese enemy planes as possible. And yes, in case you are wondering, you also play as the Americans in the Japanese version of the game. As it goes, the original plan for 1942 was more like a traditional space shooter, but the idea didn't really work out. A World War II movie called Zero, named after the Mitsubishi A6M Zero Japanese fighter, was the inspiration for the change of setting, although here you end up fighting the Zeros, as opposed to controlling one of them. You don't have bombs, but you do have a limited amount of rolls at your disposal in order to get out of sticky situations, and there's a few power-ups here and there, including one that'll allow a couple of smaller planes to accompany you. That will increase your fire, as well as providing a little bit of a shield against shots from the side. This is the first game in a lengthy series, and obviously the most basic one, but 1942 has still held up beautifully, and better than a lot of its contemporaries. Having a different setting to most of them helps a great deal, but it's simply a game that gets everything from the play to the sound absolutely spot on. Much like Time Pilot and Giras, it's still as lovely to play now as it would have been back then. A couple of years later, in 1987, we got an equally impactful follow-up, 1943, The Battle of Midway. Okamoto's planning the game once again, this time co-designing with another decorated Capcom employee, Noritaka Funamitsu, who usually goes by the nickname of, Pooh. Again, you're in command of the P-38 Lightning, duking it out with the IJN over those Pacific waters. But there's quite a lot of changes here, much more than just beefier graphics and that thoroughly catchy music. The stages in 1943 are certainly different. The first part sees you high up in the skies and blasting those enemy planes, much like the original game, but then once you get a visual on the enemy battleship, you get right down into the thick of it for the second part. The second part is kind of like a boss battle, although the goal is to destroy as much of that battleship as possible. You need to achieve a target percentage in order to successfully do that, otherwise you will repeat the second part again. Hit ratio was a part of the original 1942, seeing as you got a readout of your ratio to go along with your high score, but it's even more crucial here. You also don't get a regular life system. Instead you get a fuel bar that goes down faster when you get hit by the enemy, and this means there's no longer checkpoints. So on the whole, it's a much faster game. You still have the roll as well, although this time it's accompanied by a special attack, and there's a whole bunch of extra weapons, freeways, shotguns, and even a thoroughly authentic and historically accurate laser that is limited in ammo, but will certainly do tons of damage. Often when you get these weapons, you ideally want to save as much ammo as possible for the battleships, so this isn't necessarily a shoot 'em up where you just bash the fire button willy-nilly in the old traditional manner. 1943 is just about everything a sequel should be, really, and it was just as much of a worldwide hit as the first game was. An absolutely essential Capcom title. One more little bit of 1943. There was a second version of the game released in Japanese arcades in 1988 called 1943 Kai that came out to coincide with the original 1943's release on the Famicom. There's various updates kicking around here, different graphics, changes to some weapons, and a new set of altogether tougher stages with more massive battleships to try and take down. It is most certainly a version for super players, and definitely worth having a go at if you fancy an even bigger challenge. The only official release of this version came in Japan, although it was often available unofficially in the West as a bootleg called 1943 The Battle of Midway Mark II, so it's not as if arcade goers outside of Japan missed out on it. Avengers, from very late 1986, unfortunately has nothing to do with either the team of Marvel Comics superheroes or John Steed and Emma Peel. Instead, this is the first time that we're seeing a game by Takashi Nishiyama in the video. Nishiyama was poached by Capcom after scoring huge and very influential hits at Iren, namely Moon Patrol and especially 1984's Kung Fu Master, the latter game basically giving birth to the classic scrolling beat-em-up. Avengers also belongs in said beat-em-up genre, although it's a variation you don't often see. A top-down scrolling beat-em-up where you use your fists and feet to take out the enemies, as well as grabbing the odd weapon here and there. It's an interesting take, although not something I've ever quite gotten to grips with, especially when it comes to facing the bosses and trying to get anywhere near close enough to hit them. You can kind of see how this paled in comparison somewhat to the much more popular and influential likes of Niketsu Koha Kunio-kun, or rather Renegade, which was released a few months earlier. Not bad, but definitely not my favourite. Appropriately enough, we are now getting our introduction to Professor F, Takuro Fujiwara. Like Okamoto, Fujiwara was previously at Konami, and he'd had success there. Before Capcom, he'd scored a hit with his first game, 1982's excellent Puyan, before becoming the first big hire at Tsujimoto's new company. Fujiwara, Okamoto and Nishiyama were essentially the heads of 3 separate arcade teams at Capcom. The majority of games we're seeing in this video are going to be made by this trio, and much like Nishiyama, the first Fujiwara game that we're looking at isn't necessarily his most famous. However, it is still a popular title that is worth playing. 1987's Bionic Commando is one of those games that's much more famous on console than it is in the arcade. Capcom did unquestionably release a much deeper and better Bionic Commando game on the Famicom and NES in 1988. Still, I think that the arcade is a little underrated. It is still a very cool idea, a game where you play as a soldier named Super Joe who can't jump, but he can use his grappling hook to swing around everywhere, climbing up stages and knocking enemies about. What we have with Super Joe's Hook Arm is actually an expansion on the idea from an earlier game that Fujiwara made for Konami, that being 1983's Rock and Rope, where you used a harpoon gun to make your way up to the top of each board. Bionic Commando does the same thing, only with less limitations and a big dose of shooty action, although there is the odd subtle hint to the game's heritage, particularly the Donkey Kong-esque enemies you get kicking around that chuck crates all over the shop. Using the grappling hook can be a bit intricate at points, but there is something satisfyingly different about it as opposed to regular old jumping, and we've got some bloody great music to go along with the action as well. It's definitely worth playing Super Joe's adventure here alongside Rad Spencer's antics on the NES. Either way, Bionic Commando is a damn good time. We're going back to Yoshiki Okamoto for our next title. It's Black Tiger from 1987. Originally known as Black Dragon in Japan, this game acquired the Black Tiger name when it arrived in the States through the distribution company Romstar, who handled several Capcom games as well as titles by the likes of Taito, Toaplan, and their initial partners SNK. This is a fantasy-themed platformer, one that's a bit more darker than the earlier likes of Ghosts and Goblins when it comes to art and style. This is much more in the vein of something like Conan the Barbarian, complete with a hero that flings daggers around like they're going out of style. Unlike the earlier Ghosts and Goblins, there's also the ability to make some serious upgrades to both your weapons and armour. You usually do this by using the shops that you'll find out in the field, where you buy equipment using Capcom's preferred currency of choice, that being Zenny. Black Tiger is actually the first game where Zenny would appear as the currency, and it's appeared in all sorts of Capcom games since, including entries in some pretty large series like Street Fighter and Mega Man. Black Tiger is a perfectly decent game, although when it comes to this sort of game by Capcom, I must say I have a lot more love towards Arthur's quests to rescue Princess Prin Prin, as opposed to this barbarian's mission to take out evil dragons. You are definitely better off playing the Western version of this game as opposed to the Japanese one if you've not touched it before. There's a few changes between the versions, and the Western game is most certainly a fair bit easier going, if still tough. You're always just about guaranteed to get at least one baseball offering when you're covering a Japanese company's arcade games, and 80's Capcom is no exception. Here we have Capcom Baseball from 1989. The game is subtitled The Big Attack of the Foreign Supporter, although for the life of me I couldn't tell you why. This game only came out in Japan, and despite being released well after the debut of Capcom's CP system, it doesn't use that hardware. Anywho, this is much like 90% of the other baseball games that I've seen from the likes of Konami, Namco and whoever, although it's not a bad example of the formula by any stretch. The skills I've gathered from playing so many of these games means that I was able to get into playing this one pretty sharpish. I didn't score much in the way of home runs, but I wasn't too bad at pitching either. It's totally okay, I suppose, although I doubt I'll ever boot this one up again. I mean, why would I? Out! Here's a slight oddity. Capcom Bowling is the only game in this video that was created outside of Japan. Instead, it was made by Incredible Technologies, you know, the guys who are best known for the Golden Tee series, and then released by Capcom USA. The Capcom American studio mostly released the Western versions of console games, and indeed they still work on those to this day. And while they also released Western versions of a few Capcom arcades, Capcom Bowling here appears to be the only arcade title that was released solely by them. It's not wholly impressive, particularly for a 1988 game. It's a pretty simple and quiet top-down 10-pin bowling game that doesn't exactly hold a lot of attention. Unsurprisingly, this was released only in kit form and presumably not all that expensive, because it's just, well, generic. Whoever you think you are, this game isn't, and it's pretty easily the least essential title of this whole video. There are actually two versions of it, mind you. The regular old Capcom Bowling, and a version with advertising for Coors Light called, unsurprisingly, Coors Light Bowling. Beer ads aside, there is no difference at all between the two versions. Much like baseball games, it's inevitable when doing videos like this that you will come across quiz games that are completely unintelligible unless you know the lingo. And so here's 1989's Capcom World New Adventure Quiz. Not much to say here, really. Apparently, if you're able to make any progress in the title, you will find a bunch of cameos from other Capcom stars here and there, including the Red Arima and Dr. Wily, but obviously I'm not able to show any of that. If we were doing 90s Capcom games, we would at least get to see one of these quiz games that actually did get an overseas version. But alas, that's not the case here. Right, we've got a big old beast of a game here, one of the top bananas of the whole decade for Capcom. It is, of course, 1985's Commando, Senjo no Hakami, or Wolf of the Battlefield as it's known in Japan. This was part of a 1-2 punch from Takuro Fujiwara where he released two absolute classics that he worked on at pretty much the same time, the other title being Ghosts and Goblins, and it was the game that would utterly define the whole run-and-gun genre. It's not that Commando was the first top-down run-and-gunner or anything like that, indeed Taito's front line predates it by several years, but when you compare that game with this one, or indeed with SNK's Ikari Warriors, the other title that would set this genre on fire, well, it's a whole other level. A perfect game for the time it was born in, where you are a one-man army, named Super Joe, rushing the areas, ploughing through enemy soldiers with your gun and grenades, possibly setting free a number of hostages on the way, and hopefully killing the enemy officers when they try to flee their bases. There is not even the slightest hint of a bad note here. Commando is a complete classic, and it would be Capcom's most successful arcade hit to date. Big in Japan for sure, but a smash in the United States, and especially massive in Europe. The game did manage to ride a bit of zeitgeist, that is for sure. As much as people do tend to know that Ikari Warriors could have easily been an official Rambo game if SNK had managed to get in touch with Sly Stallone at the right time, the release of Commando matches up pretty well with the release of First Blood Part 2 in cinemas. It sure must have felt a hell of a lot like a Rambo simulator at the time, and it still more than holds up now. Brilliant. With Commando being such a huge success, Capcom clearly wanted it to be available absolutely everywhere, to the point where a special version of the game was made for the West German market, specifically to get around laws against showing humans killing other humans. And so they came up with Space Invasion. Here the enemy soldiers are replaced by robots and aliens, although other than that the game is much the same. One imagines, mind you, that the actual Commando was probably also kicking around in West German arcade and street locations, albeit unofficially. The original Commando was obviously highly in demand as far as home conversions went, with Elite Systems snapping it up and having tons of success with it, and they would also convert Space Invasion for both the Commodore 64 and Amstrad CPC. Now, it makes sense at this point to skip ahead a bit in the alphabet and cover Gun.Smoke, also released in 1985. Gun.Smoke isn't a direct sequel to Commando in the slightest, but they are both part of the top-down run-and-gun genre, and they're stylistically linked in ways that are worth going into and make a lot more sense when the games are covered together. Designed by Yoshiki Okamoto, Gun.Smoke came out a few months after Commando in October, and it's got a Wild West theme. You're Billy the Sheriff and you've got to take out a whole bunch of outlaws in the classic fashion, that being gunning them down with your pair of unlimited ammo Colt single-action army revolvers, of course. The play is a bit slower here than it is in Commando, and it is in fact an auto-scroller, which means it's got a bit more in common with a regular top-down shoot-'em-up like 1942, as opposed to a run-and-gunner. But other additions like obtaining a horse and being able to fire in several different directions with 3 buttons do bring it a lot closer to run and gunning. It's in the middle. The main reason why it's worth covering this game together with Commando is to show just how eager Capcom was to grab that Western market by the horns. More than any other Japanese studio to that point, they used Western media as their main inspiration, whether it's war movies and the 1940X titles, action movies and Commando, and now Wild West movies and Gun.Smoke. Hell, this game is directly named after the age-old TV series of the same name, although it's not an officially licensed jobby. Now, a big part of this was down to Kenzo Sugimoto, the founder himself, who often commanded his designers to watch all sorts of different movies as part of their research. It is worth noting that, beyond his little cameo in the Street Fighter film, Kenzo is a pretty big film buff. Nowadays, he's a part of Tokyo's International Film Festival, whether it's presenting awards or supplying guests with fine wine from his Napa Valley vineyard. And this love of film certainly helped shape a lot of Capcom's games. We'll be seeing a pretty damn important example a bit later on. For now, Gun.Smoke wasn't anywhere near as big a success as Commando was, unfortunately, but that doesn't mean it's not worth playing. In fact, I would recommend it pretty heavily. It is another rather underrated title in the 80s Capcom library. Here's something very minor indeed. 2 games called Dokaben from 1989 that only came out in Japan. These belong in the baseball genre, although they are visual card games as opposed to being more traditional fare, and as far as I can tell they're based off of a baseball manga that originally started running in the 1970s. Pretty simple stuff, really. You pick a card, the opponent picks a card, and the highest number wins and gets a home run or a strikeout or whatever the hell's happening. It's all quite random and I'm not sure I really see the point of it all, to be honest with you. In fact, I'd rather it was just a regular old baseball game, to be honest. But hey, even in the world of 80s Capcom, they can't all be winners. At last, we get to the first example of a Capcom Play System game. The CPS-1 would be definitive hardware for Capcom, the board that powered so many classics, and we've got several games in this video that use the CPS-1 hardware, which made its debut back in 1988 on Forgotten Worlds. We'll get to that one soon enough, but as we're going alphabetically, here's the 4th CPS-1 game, Dynasty Wars. Dynasty Wars is certainly not the most successful CPS-1 beat-em-up released in 1989 and produced by Yoshiki Okamoto, but it's a very good game indeed that is based on the Chinese era of the Three Kingdoms that has powered so many literary works. To be thoroughly accurate, it's based on a 1983 manga called Tenchi wo Kuro. Indeed, this came out at the exact same time as the Famicom RPG that is also based on Tenchi wo Kuro and was released overseas as Destiny of an Emperor. Anywho, take your pick from one of 4 legendary generals, Liu Bei, Guan Yu, Zhang Fei and Zhao Yun, and go through 8 stages that, well, will probably be familiar if you've played any Dynasty Warriors game. You'll tackle Yellow Turban rebels, face other assorted infamous enemies like Zhang Jiao, Go Si, Jehu Yuan and of course Lu Bu, before eventually going up against the final boss, Don Zhou. It's an interesting beat-em-up, one where you're on horseback and you've got different buttons for attacking left and right, you can level up, and you've also got a bunch of tactics at your disposal, rock slides, explosions, ambushes and the like. Solid stuff. And there's not really another Capcom belt scroller like this one. Even the later sequel, Warriors of Fate, while probably a better game overall, did away with a lot of Dynasty Wars idiosyncrasies. Definitely worth checking this one out. Up next, it's top-down racing time. This is F1 Dream from 1988. The idea of this one is that you start in Formula 3000 and you need to get 12 points or more to qualify for Formula 1 racing, where the cars naturally get a whole lot faster and so on. I suppose that's why the game's called F1 Dream. Now, I often struggle with top-down racing games like this, and F1 Dream isn't an exception. I just find this to be, well, rather boring, and kind of a pain in the arse, seeing as, even in the turbocharged cars, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot I can do to stop myself from getting passed by everybody and finishing last. This is undoubtedly because I am utter rubbish at this sort of game, but I don't find myself wanting to invest any time in getting better, to be honest with you. Happily though, there are more interesting top-down driving games coming up later in the video. There are so many great games in this video, but honestly, none of them may be quite as great or quite as important as Final Fight. As 90s a game as it feels, it just about makes it into this 80s video, released on November 25th, 1989. Yoshiki Okamoto's game was initially set to be a sequel to 1987's Street Fighter, with the working title of Street Fighter 89, but the lack of similarities between this new game and the original led to it getting a whole new title. Alongside Sega's Golden Axe and Konami's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Final Fight represented the new hotness in arcades of the time. These games took what Technos had previously achieved with Renegade and Double Dragon and kicked it up several notches. Again, while so much praise can be put on the flawless simplicity of Final Fight's gameplay, with it only needing 2 buttons and a few different moves to create an experience where you're always trying your best to control large crowds of enemies, almost all of whom, aside from the most basic goons, tend to be challenging in their own way, whether it's Axel blocking everything, Jay shimmying around and getting cheap shots, Bill Ball's chargers, the endless blades of Elgato, Poison and Roxy's athletics, or the Andor family simply being monsters, the presentation is really what took this to another level. While you've got a more involved plot than the norm, with Metro City Mayor Mike Hagar, Guy and Cody rescuing Jessica from the clutches of the evil Mad Gear, everything is just so damn big in this game, bigger than perhaps any other arcade game before it. Everyone's got tons of character, and it feels, well, it feels a lot like a movie, which was thoroughly intentional. Okamoto and designer Akira Nishitani were directed by Kenzo Sugimoto to watch a whole load of movies for their research, specifically the films of Walter Hill, with 1984's Streets of Fire eventually becoming the main inspiration for the game, alongside a whole load of rock and metal music. Many of the enemies' names are taken from bands or songs, whether it's the aforementioned Poison, Damned, or Sodom, and there's a good few visual homages kicking around too, with the Andor's resemblance to Andre the Giant being the most notable of them, along with Axel and Slash looking a fair bit like their Guns N' Roses counterparts. There is lots going on here, and it all comes together in one of the greatest arcade games ever made. Simple as that. A monstrous success too. This was one of the biggest games of 1990, and it's the sort of game that would just run and run on the floor. Even well into the decade, you wouldn't exactly have any trouble at all coming across a Final Fight. And it certainly helped lay the groundwork for what Capcom would achieve with Street Fighter II in 1991. It may not have happened at all without Final Fight, and it's appropriate that Metro City and a lot of the game's characters ended up becoming a part of the SF universe. A lot of the time when I am making videos, I have to reference Final Fight somewhere down the line, because it is such a crucial and influential title. So it is nice to give it a little bit of the direct love and praise that it so obviously deserves. While Forgotten Worlds is the next game on the list, alphabetically, it actually makes a hell of a lot more sense to cover it alongside Section Z and Sidearms. So we'll leave it for now, and instead, well, we're not exactly looking at something obscure here. In the course of 3 months in 1985, Takuro Fujiwara made not one, but 2 all-time classic games. We've looked at Commando already, and here we have Ghosts and Goblins. Originally released in July, Fujiwara preferred Ghosts and Goblins to Commando, and the game would become another big smash, not just in the arcades, but also at home on the Famicom and then the NES. This gloriously hard platformer, one that Fujiwara essentially tweaks the hell out of through extensive location testing in order to remove any possible easy path or exploits through the game, puts you in the boots of Arthur on his quest to go through the Demon World village and rescue the wonderfully named Princess Prin Prin, defeating all sorts of enemies along the way, including infamous ones that just so happen to be modelled after fellow Capcom employees, and eventually going through the whole journey twice in order to take on and defeat the almighty Astaroth. Now, I have done a whole extensive video on the brilliance and impact of Ghosts and Goblins, which you may want to check out, but this is another one of the games in this video that really doesn't need a whole lot of hyping up. It is, simply put, one of the best platformers you'll find in the arcade, and it is still unquestionably one of the toughest. And of course, we follow that up with a sequel that is even better. 1988's Ghouls and Ghosts, also headed up by Takuro Fujiwara, was one of the first games to use the Capcom Play system, coming out a couple of months after Forgotten Worlds, and it's one of those smashing sequels where the core gameplay is still intact and everything is just improved. Not just graphics and sound, but little quality things like being able to shoot upwards, or getting that gold suit of armour and unlocking special abilities and charge attacks. Oh, and occasionally sprinting a wizard's trap and being turned into an old man, or a duck. The journey to Loki, once again one you'll have to do twice in order to get that goddess bracelet, is tougher than ever, and even though these games are often thought of as being more successful in the home thanks to various incredibly popular console versions, whether it be the NES's Ghosts and Goblins or the Mega Drive's Ghouls and Ghosts, this was also pretty damn successful on the arcade floor, and rightly so. Again, this is one of the best arcade platformers ever made, even managing to knock off the original from its considerably lofty perch atop a mountain of skulls. The whole Nakamura franchise was even popular enough to be included in one of Capcom's Double Fever Redemption arcade machines back in 1987. You can't exactly emulate that one in MAME, sadly, but it shows just how big it was in Japan, and it wasn't far off that level of success in the rest of the world. Once again, they can't all be monumentally successful and influential classics. Our next title is 1988's Last Duel, or to give it its full title, Last Duel Interplanet War 2012, and it is definitely one of the lesser known games in this video. Mind you, that is not to say that it's bad. Takashi Nishiyama helmed this one. It feels as though we haven't seen that name in a while, especially when compared to those of Okamoto and Fujiwara, and it is perhaps true that a lot of Piston's Capcom games weren't quite as successful as the ones produced by those two, but there is still good stuff to be found outside of his most famous game from the company, which we will obviously soon get to. Last Duel is a competent mix of shooting and driving that comes off like a futuristic spy hunter in the driving parts, only with the added ability to jump, and mixes that in with more conventional top-down shooter action. It's another tricky game, one that's helped along by some nice music and really neat colourful graphics. There's nothing groundbreaking here, in all honesty, but it's the sort of thing I will happily boot up every now and again, and it probably does deserve a little more than being almost totally forgotten. Admittedly, Nishiyama followed Last Duel up with a similar game that, while still relatively obscure in the Capcom canon, is an awful lot better, thus further cementing Last Duel's obscurity. Early 1989's LED Storm, known as Mad Gear in Japan, is a lot more centred around driving as opposed to shooting. Here you're attempting to get to the end of each stage before you run out of fuel, in a similar vein to the likes of Data East's Bump and Jump and Konami's Road Fighter, and once again you can make huge jumps all over the shop. You'll most certainly need to in order to get over the gaps that always seem to be dotted around each stage. I actually really like this one. It's much better than something like F1 Dream, seeing as it's so much faster and more about making those jumps and dodging other cars, or smashing them into the barriers if you're able to. It's still not exactly the most famous of Capcom games. If you mention Mad Gear to most people, then they're probably going to think of the enemy Gan from Final Fight, as opposed to the Japanese name for this game here. But you should definitely give this one a go if you haven't. In fact, you should also give it a go on the microcomputers too. Not necessarily because this game is particularly high quality on the likes of the Spectrum and what have you, but it does have some freaking amazing music thanks to the almighty Tim Follin, who, it should be mentioned, also did brilliant tunes for the micro conversions of Bionic Commando and Ghouls and Ghosts.
Energy.
We're still sticking with old Piston Takashi for the next game. This one's Legendary Winds from late 1986, and this one's got a mixture of top-down and side-scrolling going on. We have an odd theme going on with this one. A pair of ancient Greek-themed heroes who are given winds of love by the god Ares, but they have to take out a malfunctioning supercomputer, so it's all a bit of a mishmash. The heroes change a great deal depending on what version you're playing. In the West, it's two nameless blokes, whereas in Japan, it's a man and a woman called Kevin Walker and Michelle Hart. The arcade Legendary Winds is a bit of a mixed bag quality-wise too. I think the top-down shoot-'em-up parts are pretty damn decent indeed, but the side-scrolling platform levels are a bit meh. They're just a bit too slow and ungainly for my taste. The arcade version of Legendary Winds didn't exactly set anyone's trousers on fire, but it's not all bad. The NES version of the game, however, is much more popular, and it's far superior, improving the game in many areas and making those horizontal stages a lot quicker and a lot more fun. Definitely worth playing on the console, but not an essential arcade game in the slightest. We have got a pretty well-loved game next, although also an odd one on the list when you consider how many companies were involved. It's time for Pang, or Buster Brothers, depending on where you're at. The original Pang is a collaboration between Capcom and Mitchell Corporation. Yoshiki Okamoto was the planner for the game, and Mitchell, a company that had been around for a fair while but was just starting to get into arcade games and was home to a few ex-Capcom employees, handled distribution in Japan and Europe. This is a thing of casual arcade beauty. Chase the big balloons around and pop them with your harpoons, splitting them up until they disappear and try not to get hit by them. There's a few handy power-ups kicking around such as twin harpoons, machine guns, and the ability to stop the balloons temporarily, some nice landmarks to look at as you go through the stages. It's lovely. It's not totally original, of course. It's based on an old 1983 MSX game by Hudson Soft called Cannonball, one that also ended up on the Spectrum as Bubble Buster, and Mitchell got the license from Hudson for the title. In return, Hudson would port Pang, or Pompin World as it was known in Japan, to the PC Engine CD. This is one of those beautiful little games, one that's honestly kinda hard to screw up. No matter where you play Pang, whether it's here on the arcade or on one of the many excellent conversions that Ocean oversaw for the micros, not to mention several equally superb sequels, it's just virtually guaranteed to be a damn good time. The quintessential arcade experience that isn't exactly a deep one, but is nothing but bubble-popping fun all the way through, for however long you give it a go for. We're going back a little ways for the next couple of titles, right to the early days of capsule computers. It's 1984, and this is the company's third arcade release, Pirate Ship Higemaru. This is another cool and simple little game, although it's not a wholly original title. You play as a sailor named Momotaru, and you have to rid each floor of the ship of the Higemaru pirates, grabbing barrels, bags, and other assorted items, and chucking them in their direction. The gameplay should be pretty familiar. Essentially, this is a variation on Sega's Pengo, albeit one where you can actually pick items up and move them around. Pengo is a classic, and this game is pretty cool. The ability to pick items up does make things a little more straightforward than Sega's game, although getting the knack of Pengo and learning the enemy's moves is all a part of that game's fun, and that's a little diminished here. Still neat though. Professor F planned this game, and it's certainly one of the more obscure Capcom arcades. Unlike a lot of the games here, pirate ship Higemaru never left Japan, at least not officially. There were at one stage plans to localise a 1987 Famicom sequel to the game for the States and call it Mackay Island, but that ended up unreleased. However, Mackay Island has been leaked for people to enjoy, if they desire any further spots of barrel rolling. We've got more shooter action. This next game from 1985 is probably best known under its Japanese name of Exes, but for the sake of consistency I'm using its Western name here, that being Savage Bees. This Yoshiki Okamoto shoot 'em up, as you have probably guessed, has an insect theme going on, something you'll find dotted around here and there in a few Japanese shoot 'em ups, and this may well be one of the first. Insect 'em ups tend to either be cutesy or anxiety-inducing in their presentation, and Savage Bees is definitely on the latter side. Something about the graphics and especially the game's repetitive and jarring high-pitched music really do make it a bit tense. Not to mention it's quite a toughie with enemies just coming in all over the shop. One thing that is important to note, mind you, is that this game does allow for simultaneous two-player action. Important because back in 1985 that wasn't yet a common thing in the world of shoot-em-ups, so it is a little bit of a pioneer in this regard. As far as Capcom's earliest shooters go, this one's not quite on the same level of 1942, but it's still a damn good one. Up next, we have a trio of horizontal shooters, all of which are games where instead of commanding a spaceship, you strap a jetpack to your back and get to blasting those damned aliens. First up, we've got Section Z, a Takashi Nishiyama game from 1985 where you can fire in multiple directions and you've got to go through several alphabetical sections in order to reach those goals. Kind of similar to his earlier classic Moon Patrol, only here you've got sections that scroll vertically as well as horizontally. The gameplay here is decent, just as it is in most early Capcom titles. It's definitely better than Legendary Winds as far as I'm concerned. However, much like Legendary Winds and a couple of other games in this vid, the original arcade version does get superseded somewhat by the home version for the NES, where the gameplay gets a big old do-over and you can take a bit more of a non-linear path through the game stages. That and the next two games do improve on the formula here a fair bit, meaning that while the arcade Section Z is still a totally decent title, it's not exactly as essential as the next two that we're looking at. The next game is 1986's Sidearms, also known in Japan as Hyperdyne Sidearms. Nishiyama didn't do this one. Instead we've got Okamoto and Noritaka Funamitsu taking control, and while this isn't strictly a sequel to Section Z, it feels very much like an evolution of it. You're controlling a big old flying mech here as opposed to a guy with a jetpack, and the firepower takes an appropriate boost. You can once again fire left and right, although there's power-ups that allow you to transform the mech and fire in every direction at once. This is the sort of classic shooter where having such extreme firepower can lull you into a false sense of security. You're smashing everyone left and right without a care in the world, but then one stray shot gets through when you're not paying enough attention, and suddenly you're back to square one. While Sidearms didn't end up getting the sort of excellent NES version that Section Z got, indeed it never got released on that platform at all, it is definitely the better arcade game. As with a lot of Okamoto-helmed projects, it's bigger, faster, and just generally more impressive than what came before. But still, there were ways to take this game and evolve it even further. Forgotten Worlds from 1988 isn't the biggest game in this video by any stretch. It was received very well indeed and sold a pretty good amount, but not on the level of something like Final Fight or Commando. Indeed, it didn't make much money at all because it spent about 2 years in development and cost millions of dollars to make. And yet, it is arguably right up there in terms of importance, primarily because this was the debut of the almighty Capcom Play system. This all-new, state-of-the-art hardware was a big reason why Forgotten Worlds cost so damn much to make, and Capcom certainly show it off well here with a graphically amazing, high-octane and damn good indeed dual-stick shoot-'em-up. This is a much bigger jump technically from Sidearms than that game was from Section Z. A post-apocalyptic slab of sci-fi blasting where two muscle-bound jetpackers aim to finish all of these bio-enemies today for sure, and a game that was helmed by no less than 4 designers, Okamoto, Funamitsu, Akira Nishitani and Akira Yasuda, Forgotten Worlds is the sort of game that lays the arcade groundwork for the early 90s, re-establishing the big old gap between the arcade and the home. Indeed, the rather complex dual-stick controls, complete with the rotating button that you can hammer for the Mega Crush, means that while there are a couple of okay takes on the game in the home, particularly on the Mega Drive, the arcade original is the only version that truly feels right. And it's still a great game to play so long as you configure your controls correctly, assuming that you're playing it in MAME or something similar. Bloody awesome orchestral style music as well, and an appropriately gargantuan selection of bosses. And of course, the shop where you can spend all the zenny you've accumulated, complete with one of the most irritatingly catchy themes you're ever going to find in a video games shop. It's wonderful stuff, to be honest. While Forgotten Worlds perhaps isn't quite as loved as some of the other early CP system games in this vid like Ghouls and Ghosts, Final Fight and Strider, I think it's fabulous and pretty damn close even to that trio of legends. And it should never be forgotten that it was the first title to be made for what would become an era-defining piece of arcade hardware. Our next game is another early one. SonSon from 1984 is Capcom's second ever arcade release, and the first to be designed by Yoshiki Okamoto following his arrival from Konami. In this auto-scrolling platformer, you control either SonSon or his friend Tun-Tun on their journey to find a big old statue of Buddha. As you may have guessed, the game's based on the old Journey to the West story, and the two playable characters are based on Sun Wukong and Zhu Baji respectively. The stages consist of several different levels that you jump up and drop down to, and it's pretty crucial to get the hang of that mechanic. Waves of enemies tend to occupy all levels of the stage as they come at you, and they can also change the level that they're on. While you can hit them with bolts of energy from your staff, it doesn't have a huge range, so you're going to want to dodge them as well and make sure you don't end up colliding with them. It's a little tricky, but you get used to it after a couple of plays. Again, SonSon isn't a very well-known game at all. It did get a release in North America, but it wasn't very successful there, nor was it any kind of hit in Japan. That said, I really like this one. It's a game that I enjoy coming back to every once in a while, and it's definitely in the same camp as titles like Pirate Ship Higemaru and Last Duel, as titles from Capcom that deserve a bit more love than what they usually get, even if they aren't on the same commercial level as the likes of 1942 and Commando. Still, when you talk about underrated Capcom arcade games with people, well, it might not be long before someone brings up this game here. It's the Speed Rumbler from 1986, a Takuro Fujiwara helmed title that's got a lot of driving, a lot of run and gunning, the occasional bit of exploration, a frisson of sheer shit-your-pants survival, and it chucks it all into a post-apocalyptic package straight out of Mad Max. The idea here is to drive forward quickly, rescue hostages and beat stages before Zappa's gang kills your friends and family, and needless to say doing so isn't going to be easy. The car you're in is a much more unwieldy affair than a lot of other arcade game vehicles, and actually kind of controls like you would expect a car to, and while other enemy cars can be shot down, they can most certainly blast you. If you're lucky, you will get a chance to leap out of your car and proceed on foot with a machine gun, and while you're even more vulnerable in this state, another car will appear eventually if you're able to survive long enough. Even by the standards of 1980s arcades and 1980s Capcom, this is an absolutely vicious game. Honestly, it makes Ghosts and Goblins look like a piece of piss, and it's something that I struggle to get anywhere with whenever I've tried. With that said, there's definitely some people out there who really do appreciate the massive challenge that this game offers up, and there's not a whole lot of top-down run-and-gunners like it. The game wasn't a success in the slightest and still remains relatively unknown to this day, but if you fancy playing an old Capcom game that's going to remorselessly kick the proverbial 7 shades out of you, you may well want to have a look at Speed Rumbler. I think it's fair to say that of the 3 big game planners that Capcom hired in the beginning, Takuro Fujiwara and Yoshiki Okamoto from Konami, Takashi Nishiyama from IREM, Piston Nishiyama has lagged a fair bit behind the other 2. There's been some decent Nishiyama hits here and there, but the likes of Section Z, Legendary Winds, LED Storm and Avengers are undoubtedly a fair ways behind Commando, Ghosts and Goblins, Final Fight and the 194X titles. However, we do now come to the game of his that, in this video, is unquestionably the most important one, and overall is right up there in importance with the games that I've just mentioned, and possibly even only matched in importance by Final Fight, even if it wasn't necessarily a huge hit. It is, of course, 1987's Street Fighter. Originally designed as an evolution of his earlier Kung Fu master, with a focus entirely on boss battle style encounters, the original arcade was advanced for the time it was released, and it certainly did have its own foibles, particularly those big pressure sensitive buttons that tended to break easily due to people smashing their fists down on them. But still, this is the first time that we saw Ryu and Ken in action, travelling the world and participating in a big old tournament, not to mention other characters that had played further parts in the series like Sagat, Jen, Birdie, Eagle and Adon. More than that, there's the special moves our 2 heroes wield. The Fireball, Dragon Punch and Hurricane Kick are all here, and even more than that, there's the 6-button control scheme that was devised to replace the original pressure-sensitive buttons. That scheme would define fighting games from the moment Street Fighter II used it, but the original idea came from Nishiyama's original Street Fighter. And of course it is ultimately this game that would provide something of an impetus for Nishiyama to leave Capcom and jump ship to their rivals, SNK. While Yoshiki Okamoto would take over the reins for Street Fighter II, Nishiyama would provide his own take on a sequel in the shape of the original Fatal Fury. I've done a big video on the original Street Fighter that covers all of this in more detail, but even if this is hardly the best game in this video, and even if it gets no love compared to what came after, Street Fighter II would not have been anywhere near as good if it wasn't for the groundwork laid by its predecessor. It is so much more than just a relatively forgotten debut. Well, if you know me, you may well already know what my favourite game in this whole video is, because we're about to cover it. Strider always ends up playing a major part in almost any arcade video I do, especially the lists. It was the top Capcom game in the 80s arcade countdown, only just beaten by Final Fight in my older overall arcade top 100, literally only just beaten by Street Fighter II Champion Edition in my ranking of all the Capcom CPS1 titles. The Mega Drive Strider was the subject of literally the second game review I ever did on this channel back in 2012, the good old Mega Wii Views days. So yeah, it goes without saying that it's kind of an important game for me, and one that I've shouted about a lot. And here we are again, looking at the original 1989 arcade. The whole background for Strider is a bit of a weird one. Designed from the get-go as a collaboration between Capcom and manga publishers Moto Kikaku, one that ideally would have seen a manga, an arcade game and a console game released in quick succession, it's an arcade game with a name we've not seen before at the helm, Koichi Yotsui, who originally cut his teeth in Capcom on Takuro Fujiwara's team. The whole thing didn't necessarily go as planned, seeing as apparently Capcom weren't happy with this arcade's initial performance, and the proposed console game only ever actually came out in the West for the NES, never hitting the Famicom. But my god, the result in the arcade was incredible. I can't think of any other game before Strider that was just so full of amazing action set pieces, every stage being a collection of whopping big stunts that flow almost seamlessly into one another, with the appropriately large sprites and exceptional graphics and music you would expect from a CPS1 title. It still feels so modern, exactly like the sort of brand new beat 'em up or hack and slash game that you would enjoy right now, only this came out in 1989. There is not a single part of the game where it falls down in the slightest, not one thing that could be changed. The only thing that is a shame is that the arcade game wasn't as big a hit as it should have been, although it didn't take long for Strider to get its roses, thanks in particular to that frickin' outstanding Mega Drive port. Yotsui left Capcom not long after the release of the arcade original, and a fair few of the other games that he made do scratch that Strider itch a little, especially 1996's Osman from Mitchell. But still, for me, this is one of the greatest games ever made, and one that, just like Final Fight and Ghouls and Ghosts, is just that little bit more special than every other title here. The ones that are utterly dear to my heart, the ones that, even if I wasn't doing this whole YouTube video thing, I would never ever forget. After that pair of classics, we move back to something that's a bit more minor. Here's 1987's Tiger Road. Now, I say that this game's a bit more minor, but honestly it's still a pretty excellent one. Takuro Fujiwara is once again at the helm, and what we've got here is something that gameplay-wise feels like it's in a slightly similar vein to the G&G games, although it's altogether different stylistically. This game plunges into Chinese fantasy, putting you in the sandals of a warrior monk named Li Wan, who's got to rescue his temple's children from an evil emperor. If you like hack and slasher platforms where enemies come at you from all sides, then you are going to like Tiger Road, and the enemies do have a little bit more wits about them, often coming at you with varied attacks or staying out of the range of your weapons. I really enjoy this one. I'd actually say that I enjoy it a lot more than the more famous Black Tiger, which came out in the same year. There again is not a whole lot of innovative here, but Tiger Road is just a game that's bloody good at what it does. We're staying in the realm of hack and slash for the next game as well, one that, again, is also not exactly a highfalutin and vaunted release in the Cap canon. 1986's Trojan wasn't the first game that Takashi Nishiyama worked on when he moved over to Capcom, that would have been Section Z, but it is something of a successor to his most famous and influential title, Kung Fu Master. The side-scrolling action is similar, but here we are in an irradiated and thoroughly post-apocalyptic future, one where things have got a bit Grecian, where the usual gangs of raiders are possessed by a spiritual warlord named Achilles, and Trojans here to take up sword and shield and do battle. I like this premise a lot. It's like I'm going up against Caesar's Legion from Fallout New Vegas, only in 80s arcade form. And I really like the game too. I'm not exactly going to complain about more Kung Fu Master type action from the guy who originally created it, and we've got a bunch more boss battles here as well, which is neat and may provide a little bridge between old Spartan X and Street Fighter. Like Tiger Road, this title wasn't a major success either in the arcade or in any of its home versions, but I highly recommend it. As well loved as a lot of the arcades we're covering are, there's a few bubbling under the surface that really deserve a lot more affection, and Trojan is one of them. We've got more horizontal shooter action next, and it's one of the last games Capcom released in the 80s, UN Squadron from August 1989. Yoshiki Okamoto is at the helm of this one, and in Japan at least, this game was a licensed one based on a manga called Area 88. In a later interview with Gamist magazine, Okamoto commented that this game, alongside Dynasty Wars, or Tenchi wa Corral, and Willow, the last game we'll be covering here, were part of a new strategy from Capcom that saw them make a move into creating games based on existing IPs. There's not exactly a whole lot of plot here, but Shin Kazama, Mickey Simon and Greg Gates are all from the manga, with Kazama being the main protagonist. The overriding theme in Area 88 of the trio being mercenaries under the charge of a Middle Eastern country called Aslan is somewhat passed over in favour of fighting against a more traditionally evil group of terrorists known as Project 4. All that aside, the shooting action here is bloody brilliant. One of the best shoot-em-ups in this whole video, right up there with 1943 and Forgotten Worlds. It's certainly graphically stunning and action-packed. Similarly to 1943, you get an energy bar that goes down when you take shots, as opposed to a more traditional live system, and this really speeds up the action a hell of a lot. Also, you get a ton more weapons and other assorted upgrades, most of which you buy in the shop between stages. One cool difference between this and 1943 is that the regular unlimited shot is always available to you, meaning you can save those bigger guns for boss fights or just when you need them the most. Again, it's hard to think of much that's wrong here. The only reason why I don't play UN Squadron an awful lot more is because, in the following year, it got a sequel that was even better. 1990's Carrier Airwin is one of the greatest horizontal shoot-em-ups ever made, in my opinion. But of course, we're not covering that right now. That'll have to happen when we do the 90s Capcom arcade games. I generally prefer the mostly alphabetical format for videos like this as opposed to going chronologically. I think there's more variation in games when you're jumping all over the timeline and it's a lot more enjoyable to watch. Plus, in all honesty, it can be a major pain in the rectal cavity to obtain accurate dates for things like 80s arcades. Still, it does come with the odd foible. For example, we are right near the end of the vid, with only one more game to go after this, and we're only just now covering the very first game that Capcom released to the arcades. And so here's Vulgus from May 1984, Capcom release number 1, designed by Professor F, who appropriately enough led the first team in Capcom's arcade division. Vulgus is pretty straightforward shoot-em-up action, exactly what you expect from this time period. The title and general presentation is of course quite similar to Namco's Exes, a game that you simply cannot avoid referencing if you ever look at arcade shoot-em-ups from this time period, and much like Exes, the game takes place over a single continuous level that loops as opposed to separate stages. You don't get unlimited bombs that you can chuck towards the ground here in Vulgus, as the action largely takes place in the sky, but you do get a few bigger bombs that you can use to clear the screen if you need them, and on the whole the game is quite fun, even if it's not quite as good as its inspiration. If you're a big Capcom fan, you may well recognise the Yashichi enemy that's dotted around the game. That's appeared in tons of other Capcom games over the years as a power-up, including a few that we featured in this video like Forgotten Worlds, Pan and SonSon. That's something of a Capcom trademark. And here we are, with the final game in the video. We're in June 1989, and it's time for another licensed affair. Of course, it's Willow. Whereas other licensed games we've seen tend to be based on Japanese mangas that not everyone's overly familiar with, indeed Dynasty Wars and US Squadron both completely shedded their licenses when they were imported, everyone undoubtedly knows Willow, the George Lucas penned fantasy adventure film that originally came out in 1988. You start by playing as the title character in this platformer that's got a few shades of Wonder Boy in Monsterland about it. You take out enemies, they drop coins, you buy upgrades in shops and so forth. Although naturally this game is an awful lot prettier, and definitely on the same level gameplay wise. Once you beat the first level, you'll be joined by the mercenary Mad Martigan after you free him from his cage, and you play as him in the next level. He's a fair bit slower but naturally stronger, and you switch between the two characters from there. I definitely enjoy this game more when I'm playing as Warwick Davis. The venerable host of Tenable is a lot faster, and this fits in better with how I like to play these games, although I am sure that Val Kilmer's strength and ability to take out projectiles with a flash of the blade appeals to other folks, and they both get very nice likenesses indeed in the cutscenes. Willow is a pretty good game on the whole, another decent title to notch up for Yoshiki Okamoto, and quite similar in many ways to Dynasty Wars. Not in a gameplay sense, but much like Dynasty Wars, Capcom used Willow both for a more action-packed arcade game, as well as an RPG for the NES that was released again at around about the same time. It's a nice little way to finish the whole video, and definitely a game worth playing if you haven't. And there we are. The 1980s Capcom arcades are officially, to quote the old OSW boys, in the books, in the pocket, and out of sight. There's a lot of big old guns that we've covered here, and hopefully I've done a decent job. Videos like this are always thoroughly enjoyable for me, and there will definitely be more coming. We certainly can't go without looking at IREM, the company that Kenzo Sugimoto ran before he left and formed Capcom. Of course, there's the 1990s Capcom games. I have done countdown videos for the CPS-1 and CPS-2 boards in the past, but they obviously deserve to be looked at in more depth. And obviously, there's all sorts of other companies, big and small, that hopefully will eventually get their time in the sun. But until then, I hope you've enjoyed this look over Capcom's first few years, and until the next time, bye for now.